Hi, welcome back to TalesBlip. Today's story, The Watcher in the Woods. Hi, I'm Noah Thompson. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a freelance photographer. I've been doing this for almost a decade now, and I've captured everything from cityscapes to desolate wilderness. But there's one assignment I'll never forget, something so terrifying, it still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. This wasn't just a job. It was something else. Something that changed everything. It all started with an email. I had just finished a wedding shoot, was sorting through hundreds of candid shots, and was feeling that familiar itch for something different, something more challenging. The subject line read, "Remote Cabin Project, Paid Assignment." The money was good. Actually, it was better than good. The client didn't give many details, just a simple request: photograph an old cabin in the woods. Stay overnight. At first, I thought it was one of those environmental or architectural shoots. But there was no name attached to the email, no company. Just a set of GPS coordinates leading to a remote location several hours away, deep in the woods. I hesitated, but then again, the money made it hard to say no. Plus, the idea of a quiet night in the wilderness appealed to me. It would be a nice break from the constant buzz of the city. I packed my gear and headed out early. The drive took me through a series of small towns, each one quieter and more isolated than the last. The roads became narrower, more rugged, and eventually, I found myself deep in the forest, miles from any sign of civilization. By the time I reached the coordinates, the sun was already sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin was exactly what I expected: old, weathered, and forgotten. It stood alone, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. As I stepped out of the car, a strange chill ran through me, even though it was still early fall. The air felt different. Heavier somehow, like the forest itself was watching me. I took a deep breath, shook off the uneasy feeling, and grabbed my camera gear from the trunk. As I walked toward the cabin, the wooden steps creaked under my weight. The door was slightly ajar, and a musty smell wafted out: damp wood in decay. The kind of smell that told me no one had lived there for years. Inside, the cabin was just as dilapidated. Dust-covered furniture, an old stone fireplace, and a single bed with a mattress that had seen better days. A small table sat near the windowless walls, its surface scratched and worn. I set my bags down and took a moment to absorb the stillness of the place. It was unnervingly quiet: no birds, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. I started with exterior shots while there was still some light. The surrounding woods seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. As I snapped picture after picture of the gnarled trees and the cabin's sagging roof, that unsettling feeling crept back. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone, though the nearest town was at least 30 miles away. I turned back toward the cabin and took a few more shots. That's when I noticed something odd. There were no windows, not a single one. Just 4 solid walls enclosing the small structure. I hadn't noticed it when I first arrived, but now it struck me as incredibly strange. What kind of cabin doesn't have windows? I shrugged it off and went inside to continue photographing the interior. The light was fading fast, and without electricity or running water, the only illumination came from the single candle I'd brought with me. The flickering flame cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, making the room feel smaller, more confined. The shadows seemed to move on their own, crawling up the walls as if they had a life of their own. I finished taking my photos and sat down at the small table, reviewing them on the tiny screen of my camera. Everything seemed fine at first. The shots were moody, atmospheric, exactly what I was going for. But as I flipped through them, something caught my eye. In one of the exterior shots of the cabin, there was a figure. A tall, dark silhouette standing just at the edge of the woods, barely visible but unmistakably there. My stomach lurched. I hadn't seen anyone when I took the photo. I zoomed in, trying to get a better look, but the figure was blurry, undefined. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing. Was it a person? An animal? Or something else? I set the camera down and tried to calm my nerves. I was out in the middle of nowhere. There was no reason for anyone to be here, especially not at this time of night. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the trees. But the longer I sat there, the more that gnawing feeling of being watched grew. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustling, like something moving through the leaves outside. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, more distinct, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and pointed it at the door, but I didn't dare open it. The footsteps stopped. Silence. For a long moment, I held my breath, straining to hear anything that might explain what was happening. Then, there was a loud knock. Just one, hard and deliberate, on the door. I jumped, the sudden sound echoing through the small cabin. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. I slowly stood up, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. Just as my fingers touched the cold metal, the door creaked open on its own, just a crack. The air inside the cabin grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your skin prickle. I shined my flashlight through the crack, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. I quickly slammed the door shut and locked it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it the wind? An animal? I didn't know, but I wasn't about to go outside to find out. I needed to stay calm, think rationally. I sat back down at the table, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for the next sound. But for a long time, there was nothing. Just the flickering of the candle and the distant creak of the old cabin settling into the night. I tried to distract myself by going through the photos again, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the camera. As I scrolled through the images, my heart nearly stopped. In one of the interior shots, taken just minutes before, there was something else. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, just out of the reach of the candlelight. Tall, thin, and utterly still. I hadn't seen anyone when I took the picture. My stomach twisted in knots as I stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure had no face. Just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should have been. Panic gripped me. I stood up, knocking the chair over in my haste. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light around the room. I backed away from the table, my eyes darting to the corners, expecting to see that figure standing there, waiting. But the room was empty. Completely and utterly empty. The footsteps started again. This time, they were closer, heavier. They circled the cabin slowly, deliberately, as if whatever was out there was toying with me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the flashlight like it was my only lifeline. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Silence. Then, the door handle began to turn. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as the door creaked open, just a fraction. A sliver of cold, dark air seeped in, but I couldn't see anything beyond the crack. The candle flickered violently, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The door remained half open. And the darkness outside seemed to press in, thick and suffocating. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, my eyes fixed on that crack in the door, waiting for whatever was out there to step inside, but it never did. Instead, the door slowly closed on its own, the handle clicking back into place. The footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. I stood there for a long time, too scared to move, too terrified to breathe. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I grabbed my bag and bolted for the car. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the assignment, or the money, or the cabin. I just needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. I drove through the night, not stopping until I was miles away, back in the safety of civilization. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me back. The first few nights, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing things outside my apartment, footsteps, faint and deliberate. I would rush to the window, hoping to catch whoever was there, but I never saw anyone. The sound of the footsteps would fade, but the fear remained. It wasn't just the sounds either. Things started moving. My camera, which I always left on my desk, would be found across the room in the morning, or I'd wake up to my apartment door slightly ajar when I was sure I had locked it. I told myself it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had come back with me from the cabin. Then came the photos. A few days after the incident, I found new images on my camera. At first, I thought I had accidentally taken them during the panic, but as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. The pictures showed my apartment, my bedroom, my living room, even me, asleep in my bed. Each photo was taken at night, from different angles. As if someone or something had been watching me while I slept. In the corner of one of the photos, barely visible, was that same figure from the cabin. Tall, thin, and faceless, standing just outside my bedroom door. That's when I realized it wasn't just in my head. Whatever had been at the cabin had followed me home. I tried everything to get rid of it. I moved to a different apartment, changed my number, even stopped taking photography assignments for a while. But no matter where I went, the footsteps would find me. Slow. Deliberate. Unrelenting. It's been months now, and the fear has become my constant companion. I don't know what that thing is or what it wants, but I know it's not going to stop. Every night, I hear it. Outside my door, outside my window, just waiting, and I know, deep down, that one day, it's going to come in. Let's move to our next story. Story name: The Whispering Curse. Hi, I'm Sam Williams, and I'm 32 years old. By profession, I'm a civil engineer, but my real passion has always been traveling and photography. I've explored some of the most remote places in the world, places where very few dare to go. But this story isn't about the beauty of untouched nature or capturing perfect sunsets. No, this is about a trip that changed everything for me. A trip that left me questioning reality itself. I wish I could forget what happened, but every time I close my eyes, it's all I see. The year was 2022. After years of planning, I finally saved up enough to spend a couple of weeks traveling through rural Eastern Europe, specifically an area I had been fascinated with for years: the Carpathian Mountains. These mountains were shrouded in mist, myth, and mystery. Local legends spoke of creatures that roamed the woods at night, spirits of the dead, and ancient curses. Of course, I didn't believe in any of that. I had booked a small cabin through an obscure website. It was tucked away in a remote village at the base of the mountains, a place barely touched by time. The village, if you could even call it that, had only a few dozen residents, and most of them were elderly. There was no internet, no cell phone reception, just silence and nature. I arrived at the cabin on a cold, foggy afternoon. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. It had the rustic charm I was looking for: wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a view of the mountains from the front porch. I settled in quickly, unpacked my gear, and decided to take a short walk before dusk. I wanted to scout out the area for potential photo spots. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense and eerie. Trees stood like tall, silent sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled. The undergrowth was thick with brambles and dead leaves, and the air felt unnaturally still. As I walked deeper into the woods, the path became less defined, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. About half an hour into the hike, I came across something strange. It was a clearing, but not a natural one. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated church. It looked abandoned, with its wooden doors hanging off their hinges and vines creeping up its stone walls. There were no windows, just small slits that barely let any light inside. The roof had partially collapsed. And the place had an aura of deep neglect. I had no intention of exploring the church that day. I was alone, and it was starting to get dark. So, I took a few pictures of the exterior and headed back to the cabin. But as I walked away, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as though I was being watched. I turned around, scanning the woods, but there was nothing, only trees and shadows. I chalked it up to nerves and quickened my pace. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, I couldn't stop thinking about the church. Something about it seemed out of place, almost like it didn't belong there. I decided I would go back the next day and take a closer look. The next morning, the fog was even thicker than before, and the sky was a flat, dull gray. I grabbed my camera and a flashlight and set off for the church. The forest felt different this time. The silence was oppressive, and I could hear nothing but the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Even the birds were silent. When I reached the clearing, I hesitated for a moment. The church looked even more foreboding in the daylight, its decaying structure standing in stark contrast to the vibrant green of the forest. I approached the doors cautiously. One of them creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The inside of the church was in even worse condition than the outside. The pews were broken, and the floor was littered with debris. But the most unsettling thing was the altar at the far end of the room. It was covered in strange symbols, scratched deep into the wood. I couldn't make sense of them, but they didn't look like anything I had seen before. I snapped a few photos and walked around, trying to find anything that could explain why the church had been abandoned. There were no records, no signs, nothing. Just silence. But then, I heard it, a faint whisper, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper came again, louder this time. It was coming from the altar. Slowly, I walked towards it, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I got closer, the whispering grew more distinct, though I couldn't understand the words. It sounded like multiple voices speaking at once, in a language I didn't recognize. I reached the altar and shone my light on it. There was nothing there. No hidden speakers, no trick of the light, just the altar, with its strange markings. But the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. As I turned to go, something caught my eye. In the corner of the church, where the shadows were darkest, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. But then it stepped into the light. It was a person, a woman, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide, unblinking. She didn't speak, but her mouth moved as if she were whispering the same words I had heard earlier. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I tried to say something, ask her who she was, but the words caught in my throat. Then, she started walking towards me. Slowly at first, then faster, her mouth still moving in that unnatural whisper. I didn't wait to find out what she wanted. I turned and bolted out of the church, my camera clattering against my chest as I ran. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in around me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just some local woman who lived nearby, someone playing a trick on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something wrong with that place, something I couldn't explain. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her wide, unblinking eyes staring into mine. The whispering echoed in my mind, relentless and maddening. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I had been wide awake. The next few days were a blur. I didn't go back into the forest. I didn't want to risk seeing her again. But the whispering.it didn't stop. Even in the safety of the cabin, I could hear it, faint at first, then louder as the days passed. It was like she was always there, just out of sight, watching me, whispering to me. I decided to cut my trip short. There was no way I was staying another night in that cabin. I packed my things as quickly as I could and drove back to the nearest town. On the way, I stopped at a small roadside cafe to grab a coffee and gather my thoughts. I struck up a conversation with the owner, a man in his 60s, who had lived in the area his entire life. When I mentioned the church, his face went pale. He told me the church had been abandoned for over 100 years. According to local legend, it was cursed. A long time ago, a woman had been accused of witchcraft and executed in that very church. Before she died, she had cursed the village and the surrounding woods, vowing to come back and take revenge on anyone who dared enter her domain. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as just another ghost story, but the man's expression didn't change. He told me that several people over the years had disappeared after visiting the church. And those who had survived claimed to have seen the woman, just like I had. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew it was true. I had seen her. I had heard her whispers. That was 2 years ago, and I haven't been back to the Carpathians since. But even now, back home, thousands of miles away, I can still hear her sometimes. In the dead of night, when everything is quiet, I hear the whispering. It never stops. It's like she's waiting for me, biding her time. I don't know how much longer I can take it. Maybe one day, I'll go back. Maybe I'll find out what she wants. Or maybe that she'll come for me. I guess only time will tell.